PTIN Requirements.
PTIN requirements. A PTIN is a 9-digit number that preparers must use when they prepare and sign a tax return or a claim for a refund. If you've prepared tax returns professionally, then you have a PTIN. You have to have a PTIN if you prepare tax returns for compensation. The use of a PTIN is mandatory on all federal tax returns and claims for a refund prepared by a paid tax preparer. Now, if you're just a volunteer or you're preparing tax returns for your family and friends and you're not charging them, then that's different. But if you prepare tax returns for compensation, then you have to have a PTIN. So the PTIN requirements applies to all enrolled agents. All enrolled agents have to have a PTIN. All enrolled agents have to have a PTIN. And then attorneys and CPAs that prepare tax returns for compensation. Not all attorneys and CPAs prepare tax returns. So if the attorney or the CPA does not prepare tax returns for compensation, then they don't need a PTIN if they don't prepare federal tax returns. But all enrolled agents have to have a PTIN. And this is where it goes. It goes right down here in the preparer section of the return, and that's where you would put it. Example, Trudy is a licensed attorney who specializes in employment law. She does not prepare tax returns for compensation. During the year, Trudy is hired by Jonathan, a business owner who wants to contest a negative worker classification audit by the IRS. The IRS determined that Jonathan was improperly classifying his employees as independent contractors in order to avoid paying payroll taxes, but Jonathan vehemently disagrees. And this is actually a very common type of case that goes to the U.S. tax court, is worker classification issue, where the employer is treating, let's just say, workers as independent contractors, and the IRS audits the employer and determines that they should have been classified as employees. Okay, most of the time employers lose this. Employers lose this case, but not always. Sometimes they prevail, although that's rare. Jonathan has already received a notice of deficiency from the IRS, so Trudy files a petition in the U.S. tax court on his behalf, and she will also represent him before the U.S. tax court if the case goes to trial. Although Trudy is representing her client in court in an IRS-related matter, she is not required to obtain a PTIN because she does not prepare tax returns. He was audited by the IRS for worker classification. He's a business owner with employees, and the IRS is saying that he misclassified his employees as independent contractors. He doesn't agree, so he wants to take his case to court. He goes to the U.S. tax court. He hires an attorney to represent him. Trudy is the attorney. She's a licensed attorney, but she doesn't have to obtain a PTIN. She doesn't have to have a PTIN because she's not preparing tax returns for compensation. This is an IRS issue, right? It's a worker classification issue, but she's just representing him in court as a lawyer. She can file a U.S. tax court petition as an attorney and represent him without obtaining a PTIN, because the PTIN is only required if you prepare tax returns for compensation or if you're an enrolled agent. So all enrolled agents have to have a PTIN. Even if you don't prepare tax returns for compensation, you still have to have a PTIN if you're an EA. Okay? I want you to understand there's a distinction here, because all EAs have to have a PTIN, but CPAs and attorneys do not automatically have to have a PTIN. And that's true even if they deal with the IRS. Okay, so if it's an attorney and they're representing clients during examinations or in IRS appeals, but they don't actually prepare tax returns, then they don't have to have a PTIN. Okay? Returns not prepared for compensation. An individual who prepares a tax return with no agreement for compensation is not considered a tax return preparer for IRS purposes. This is true even if the individual receives a gift or a favor in return. The agreement for compensation is the deciding factor as to whether the IRS considers an individual a tax return preparer. Now, I want you to understand the distinction here. If you're preparing tax returns for family and friends and you're not charging them, then you're not considered a tax return preparer. If you are preparing tax returns and you are charging them, even if it's just $5, then you're considered a tax return preparer. The agreement for compensation is what matters. If you prepare a tax return for someone and you invoice them and then they don't pay you, you're still considered a tax return preparer with regards to that particular tax return. So if you have an agreement for compensation, then that's the deciding factor. And let me give you an example. Melanie is a retired CPA who only prepares tax returns for her close family members. She does not charge her family to prepare their tax returns. Sometimes a family member will give Melanie a gift in return. This year, her sister gave her home-baked cookies and her niece gave her a sweater. However, Melanie did not ask for any presents or expect them. She is not a tax return preparer for IRS purposes, and she is not required to obtain a PTIN. So she's not considered a preparer in this case because there's no agreement for compensation. She says, I'm going to do your tax returns for free. You don't need to worry about it. Even if they give her a gift later, there's not an agreement for compensation anywhere here. So she's not considered a tax return preparer. She doesn't have to obtain a PTIN, and she's not also considered a preparer for the purposes of the preparer penalties. Here I am on IRS publication 4491. This is the official volunteer income tax assistance guide. So this is basically like a training manual for the VITA tax program that the IRS puts on every single year, volunteer income tax assistance and tax counseling for the elderly. I feel like this is a very good reference, this IRS publication. There's a lot of good examples in here, but I'm going to show you what it says about volunteer income tax preparation, which is income tax preparation without compensation. If you scroll down a few pages and you go to the section that says, am I legally liable for the returns I prepare? It says right here, VITA TCE program volunteers are not considered paid preparers. Okay, so they do not accept compensation for the returns that they prepare. Therefore, you are not legally liable under federal law for the return that you prepare. This means that you cannot accept payment of any kind from the taxpayer for preparing a federal return or for providing any other tax-related assistance. This would apply to any kind of tax preparation that was not for compensation. Okay, if you do not accept any type of compensation for preparing tax returns, that would be a volunteer preparation, or you would not be considered a paid preparer. You are protected by the Federal Volunteer Protection Act of 1997 as long as all of the following conditions are true. You are acting within the scope of your volunteer responsibilities. You have completed the level of training and certification required for preparing tax returns at your site, and the harm was not caused by willful, criminal, reckless, grossly negligent, or conscious, flagrantly indifferent acts. What this means basically is that you can't knowingly be preparing false returns, even if you do it as a volunteer or as an unpaid preparer. So you can't, add fake dependents or put in fake deductions. You have to be acting in good faith, but you're not considered a paid preparer if the returns are not paid. For example, if you're just doing it on a volunteer basis or for family and friends, then you're not considered a paid preparer if you don't have an agreement for compensation. Now, you need to know for the exam which individuals are not required to have a PTIN, because these people are not considered paid preparers, so they don't have to request a PTIN. An individual is not considered an income tax return preparer and would not be required to obtain a PTIN in the following instances. A person who just gives an opinion about events that have not yet happened, such as tax advice for a business that has not been created. And an example that the IRS gives is like a CPA or an enrolled agent, a tax practitioner, and their neighbor asks them for advice, like, hey, Bob, or hey, Jane, I'm considering opening a business. Do you have any suggestions for me? So if you were to give tax advice that was kind of nebulous like that about something that has not yet been created, or something that hasn't been, a business that hasn't been opened yet, or anything like that, then you're not considered a paid preparer in that case, because you're not actually preparing a return. You're just giving advice in general about tax law, and you're giving advice about something that hasn't happened yet. If you're giving tax advice for a business that has not been created or for something that hasn't happened, then you're not required to have a PTIN. A person who furnishes typing, copying, or mechanical assistance. For example, if you have like a front desk person, like an administrative assistant that just copies paperwork or makes appointments, then that person is not considered a preparer. A person who prepares the return of his or her employer, or an officer or employee of the employer. For example, if you have a bookkeeper that's preparing payroll tax returns for their own employer, then that person is not considered a preparer and they're not required to have a PTIN. And that's true even if they're earning wages by being employed by this business. It's because when you're an employee of a business or an officer of a corporation, you're not considered a paid preparer if you're actually preparing the return of that business that you're working for. You're not required to have a PTIN in that case. The employer is the one that's ultimately responsible for the accuracy of that return. A fiduciary who prepares a tax return for a trust or an estate. So for example, if I'm the executor of my brother's estate or my father's estate, or for a trust, if I'm a trustee of a trust, then I'm not considered a paid preparer in that case, even if I am being paid, because a fiduciary is a different thing. An unpaid volunteer who provides tax assistance under Volunteer Income Tax Assistance, that's the VITA program, or tax counseling for the elderly, TCPE programs. These are all unpaid volunteers and they're not considered paid preparers in this case. Many of them do have PTINs because they're preparers anyway. Sometimes you'll have like retired CPAs or retired enrolled agents who have PTINs and they're volunteering for these programs, but they're not considered paid preparers. If they're actually volunteering, then those returns that they prepare, they're considered like unpaid returns or not prepared for compensation. An employee of the IRS who performs official duties by preparing a tax return for a taxpayer who requests it. An employee of the IRS who's preparing tax returns because a taxpayer asked them to do so on their behalf is not required to have a PTIN, and they're not considered paid preparers in this case either. Now, do not confuse a PTIN with an EFIN. The PTIN identifies you as a preparer. The EFIN identifies the location of where the returns are being e-filed or originating. You can prepare tax returns without an EFIN. And in fact, the e-file program does not accept foreign preparers without social security numbers who live and work abroad. Every paid preparer has to have a PTIN, but there are preparers who are not eligible for an EFIN. They can't e-file clients' returns because you have to have a social security number in order to obtain an EFIN. That's the electronic filing identification number. Now, if you are a U.S. citizen or a legal U.S. resident with a social security number, then you can obtain an EFIN as well as a PTIN in order to e-file your client's returns. But just realize that you can have a PTIN and not be eligible for an EFIN. But every preparer that prepares tax returns for compensation is required to have a PTIN.